Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality. Shattered Reality. Shattered Reality. Shattered Reality.
Hi, welcome back to Shattered Reality. We are indeed the aforementioned host, Fahrusha, a very famous New York psychic, also the authoress of several fascinating blog posts. I am Kate Valentine, a longtime sort of studier of ufology with a few radio shows under my belt. And we are both fortunate today to have as our guest the illustrious Mr. David Biedny. And Fahrusha, if you will go over some of David's credentials.
Well, many people who may be listening to us probably remember David from his 4-year term as the co-host on the Paracast. He was on for 4 years talking about all kinds of phenomena and talking to people and sometimes eviscerating the fakers. Yes, indeed. And he is currently at an Ivy League college, being a teacher of digital media. In the past, he has been a multimedia expert, and he has given info to the NARCAP report, and he worked on the O'Hare sighting. In addition, he was one of the original people who worked on Photoshop, and he actually wrote the first manual ever for the Photoshop program. So, without further ado, let me introduce my friend and very, very interesting gentleman, David Biedny.
I hope I can live up to that greeting.
David, you can live up to that and more. You are one of the more fascinating people I've ever spoken to.
Oh, man.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is from a lady who can't even use her webcam or her little web camera. I still have a track phone, so that's where I'm at. But, you know, David, I really wanted to speak to you because you're one of the few people that are interested in this field, but you, when I met you a long time ago, you asked me if I had my druthers, what would I want the UFOs to turn out to be? Mm-hmm. And I remember telling you I really had, you know, I would like this, I would like that, but I really didn't care as long as one day I found out what they were. And you agreed with that. And you are one of the few people in this field that I've met that really don't have an angle. You just really attack it and sort of sort things out. And do you find that to be true about yourself?
I come at this from a weird place in that I'm someone who, in the 4 years that I did the Paracast, 2006 to 2010, interestingly enough, I sort of got put in that box of debunking. Because part of what I did on that show was to take some of the sort of the holy cows of the field and take them down. Just simply ask relevant, logical questions. So I got put in that box. It seems like everything that goes on in our culture nowadays is about this extreme polarization. Whereas the reality is that I got into doing the Paracast primarily because I wanted to have rational, reasonable discussions about the lifetime of anomalous experiences that I had that I couldn't talk about in mixed company. And I also found I couldn't have reasonable conversations because everybody immediately had their conclusions, which they wanted to sort of force down your throat when you would talk about. So when I would talk about things, people would say, well, it's this, that, or the other thing. And I sort of came to understand that I walk this very weird middle line, which is that, you know, when I look at debunkers basically assume, they make the assumption that everything is prosaic, everything can be explained by science as science currently stands, and that people who report having odd experiences are basically just making the stuff up, or they're suffering mental disease, or any number of explanations that fall into the sort of the expected. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, the people who go by various names, there's a term I constantly hear is the woo people, who basically assume that they know what's going on with take your pick of whatever anomalous thing we're talking about. They know what it is. They understand the motivations of whatever it is, and for a lot of those people, the getting interested in the anomalous is sort of like a proxy religion. I stand right in the middle in that my assumption is that the human mind in its current state of evolution is not capable of understanding what is most likely the truth behind a lot of this stuff, which is not a comfortable place. People want to have answers. They're very uncomfortable facing the prospect of not having any kind of answers, or even being told, even if you had the answers, your brain in its current state of evolution, all of our brains, could not process this information.
Well, that's something that I've written about on my blog, that people don't like the entire idea that something could be smarter than them. And I don't mean that there isn't somebody who can do nuclear physics and they can't, but somebody or some being that is so much smarter than them that that being looks on them like, like a flea or
like we look at an ant.
Yeah.
Sure.
So since we may just simply be lab rats, I'm almost going to jump into this, because this is a question that I have been asking myself lately in terms of those persons who have had legitimate contact with another intelligence outside of our ken, so to speak. What's your position on the thought that these others might be lying to us versus the idea that what they tell us we just simply misunderstand?
I'm getting the feeling you were listening to some old Paracast recently. Well, that was a sort of a key position I took, which is to assume that if you were dealing with a superior intelligence of any sort, there's absolutely no reason to believe that it would be straightforward and honest. There's every reason to believe that it would incorporate some level of deception in order to protect itself, in the same way that humans do. We now know that dogs will basically play games with each other to deceive each other. I wrote an essay years ago called "The Truth About Lies" that's floating around online, right? Which is just about the fact that it seems, I say the fact, but it seems clear to me that humans, to some degree, are addicted to deception. It's our default mode of being. This is not a pleasant revelation. It's something that really kind of it's frustrating, and it's a little sickening in a way, because all of us like to think that we are seeking the truth at all times. I've come to believe that that's not the case. And so the idea that if we had a superior intelligence in dealing with us directly, that it would be honest and truthful, it wouldn't really be that intelligent if it was honest and truthful with us. Because again, I don't know that we could handle the truth.
But the things that appear to be lies that sometimes come out of these meetings of the mind, shall we say, would appear to be things that you don't necessarily need to lie about. Although some of the things, like we come from Venus to the to the contactees and so forth, well, that certainly makes some sense. That throw them off the scent.
Well, are you talking about abductees or people who say that they're abductees?
I was talking specifically, I threw in a reference to the contactee movement, where there were a number of people, and the names sort of elude me at the moment, who said that the others said that they came from Venus.
Yeah.
And then clearly, Venus is extraordinarily hot, and it's highly unlikely, unless they're, sulfur beings or something like that they are actually living on Venus.
Those claims came out of a time when our scientific understanding of the solar system was compromised compared to now. And it does seem, I don't put any weight into any of that early contactee stuff at all. To me, it's just completely bogus. I don't buy any of it. And that's not to say that I don't strongly suspect that humans throughout history have had direct interactions with non-human entities. I think that is not only highly probable, I think that's indeed happened and is ongoing. But again, to try to then come down to understanding the motivations for these interactions, I think that is beyond our current level of understanding of reality in general. I'm as someone who's really motivated by understanding science, I'm always fascinated about how much we don't know about everything. Take your choice.
Well, even up until, 20 years ago, most astronomers would tell you, well, maybe there are other planets, but right now we have no evidence of that, which is like so ridiculous a statement. Even back then, even as a child, I thought, well, how could that be?
No, well, they didn't want to go on a limb. They were basically they were practicing sound science. They didn't want to make assumptions.
Okay, but then again, I think that's what keeps people who make a living doing science out of ufology, because it is definitely a career killer. I mean, no two ways about that.
Pretty much.
That's a fact. I'll go with that.
Yeah. And that was my own experience. I found that to be true.
Mm-hmm. And I just wrote a response to somebody on our website there that the person was sort of talking about Seth Shostak and how he has distanced himself from the UFO field. And while I think that may be a mistake on his part, I do think that he probably saw it as a career killer, basically, and he needed to distance himself from what the media portrays people who are ufologists as crazy people wearing tinfoil hats,
Yeah, but that's Shostak's own making. I saw Shostak go on shows where he showed up with little alien head bobblehead dolls, and he would just basically...
Oh, he was bad.
He's terrible, just making fun of people, not engaging in anything I'd call genuine scientific inquiry.
And I forget the fellow's name now, Jeff, I can't think of his last name, but he was the one astronomer that said, look, there have to be other planets, and he was the one that found the Pegasus planet. And so you would think that some young person today that would want to make a name for themselves would say, look, there's enough evidence here that something is going on. But again, at least with the planet hunters, they had some data, some means of investigating it. The problem with UFOs has been stated a gazillion times, is that there's no consistent data. There's no one place you can go to investigate. It's, if you're happy and lucky enough to be there with one of your media cameras, then great, you get it. If you're not, then you're missing.
Lucky enough?
Well,
I would dispute that.
Lucky, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I don't think lucky is a good word. And at this point, we also have to just recognize and realize, and I say this the day after we're recording this, the day after the 25th anniversary of Photoshop's release to the market formally. At this point in time, the validity, veracity, and usefulness of specifically still image evidence is pretty much out the window. It's gone.
Okay.
Photographic evidence is now so suspect because usually it lacks context. Usually it lacks any kind of triangulation. When the day that I see the UFO photograph that has been shot by 3 separate people on their cell phones from 3 different positions that shows consistency, 3 people who are willing to go on the record with their real names, prove who they are, deliver images that clearly are not hoaxed, that are legitimate, that have the right kind of data in them to suggest that they're legitimate. And so let's say you had those photos. Let's say you had that witness testimony.
Okay.
Let me tell you what you wouldn't have. You wouldn't have any kind of information about the sourcing of, let's say it's a UFO, right? You wouldn't know where the UFO came from. You wouldn't know what it was made of. You wouldn't know what was in it. You wouldn't know what it was doing here. you pretty much know nothing except that there is some anomalous thing in the sky that is now being corroborated.
Exactly.
So it's not like even like the discovery of other planets is not the same thing as the discovery of life on other planets.
Because it's still there, and other people can go back and verify the original investigation, and that you don't have. It's just maddening, I find.
Well, and that suggests to me, I mean, and this is something I've come to believe, and I use the word belief and I emphasize it because the thing about beliefs is that you can believe anything. On a personal level, you don't even need to prove things to yourself. You can simply believe them based on free will. So belief to me is kind of a problematic word. It always has been. But you can, coming back that round to my original statement I want to make. In the end, you can believe whatever you want. And what was I going to say? I was going to say something that I believe. And then I went off on a tangent to discuss the context of the word belief. I do that a lot, by the way. I have a very non-linear mind. Yeah, it's not getting better as I get any older.
Well, I think we're talking about investigating science and being able to recapitulate an original discovery or investigation. Or
Goldilocks planets, not necessarily having life.
Yeah.
Well, and then again,
of course they have life. I mean, DNA, I'm sure, is universal. To me, and again, okay, here's a. Okay.
I'm not so, but you see, you use the word "you're sure."
No, let me take that back. I stopped right away, if you'll notice.
Okay. Yeah.
But anyway, that would be an aspect that I would definitely follow through with very good hope that it would bear fruit. In other words, there are some investigations like into UFOs that you do as a pastime because to put a lot of time and money into it, probably the payout is going to be zero by the time you hit the big one. But something like investigating DNA, yeah, I think that's a possibility. And of course, I don't know. But that would be my belief, that would be a potentially fruitful line of investigation.
All right.
Whereas UFOs, again, they just... I would love to investigate them more closely, but after a long time spending time in this field, I think I've sort of given up hope a little bit.
So here's the problem with all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
In order to get someone who's going to be able to approach the topic of UFOs in a level-headed way, it's my belief that you have to deal with somebody who's had a personal experience. If not, then you have people who basically are thrill chasers. You have people who, and they come to it with their own preconceived set of notions. For a lot of these people, it's either become a proxy religion or it's just become another pastime. It's just a hobby. It's something they do for fun. They like the thrill of it. They like the unknown, and all that's fine. But that person is going to approach all of this with a very different level of vested interest in getting to, my old tagline on the Paracast was trying to separate the signal from the noise. There's a ton of noise, and in order to cut through the noise, to get signal, one has to have sort of a certain type of, I believe, motivation, which is about finding personal truth. So somebody doesn't have an anomalous, let's say somebody who gets interested in UFOs who's never seen one, it's fine from an entertainment point of view, but I believe that person does not have the kind of internal motivation that's going to lead them down things that are truthful. It's going to lead them to things that are interesting, maybe compelling, maybe mystifying, maybe a little scary because people like being scared. That's why horror movies do so well. So now you have to have somebody, you have to try to get somebody who's had an experience. And what I can tell you from that is that when people have what I would consider to be genuine anomalous experiences, it tends to damage them.
Yes.
And
yes,
so,
indeed.
Right, and I've doing the Paracast for 4 years. I talked to some number of people over those 4 years who had like one anomalous experience when they were kids, and it screwed them up for the rest of their lives. It basically really distorted their worldview in many ways. And so those people, also the idea of true objectivity and scientific clarity, you're not going to find in most of those people because they've had this experience. It's sort of the equivalent of a personal religious experience. And so now they're looking to either recreate the experience because they want that thrill, that endorphin rush to the mind that happens when your brain sees something, your eye sees something that your brain tells you cannot be there. and yet your eyes are seeing it, and then you have corroborating people standing next to you going, I see that too. And then it's this idea that there are consensual sort of mass hallucinations is very problematic. It's very, very rare if it's happened at all.
It's kind of ludicrous, actually.
Well, a little ludicrous. I think there are certain situations where you could possibly draw the potential of something like that happening, but the idea that happens on any kind of regular basis is sort of nonsensical.
David?
Yes.
I've had the experience of having people tell me that the raw biological terror that I have felt, and I know that other experiencers have felt, is just fear, and it can be conquered. And when somebody says that to me, I know they've never had that experience.
Yeah.
Because it has nothing to do with your psychology and that you're fearing something happening, because the onset is totally unexpected, and the fear is not fear, but like a raw biological terror.
Well, it's old programming in our brains. It's that what I think is often referred to as the lizard brain. It's the idea that you can use logic to conquer fear. I have some problems with that, especially when you're witnessing something that, again, your brain is saying to your eyes, there's just no way this is happening. And I had discussed on the Paracast publicly one particular episode involving a very old friend of mine in Florida, where we saw this really weird apparition of some sorts. We interacted with it at close proximity, and we watched this thing dematerialize. We watched it would look like a human.
Could you give us a little bit of background about that story? That sounds really interesting.
It's kind of a drawn-out story, but the long and short of it is that an old friend of mine and myself in southern Florida, we're hanging out one day, and we see this very odd apparition. It looked like a human female sort of gliding across this walkway in this center part of a condo complex.
Wow.
And the thing that really, and to this day, this happened a number of years ago, and I still, and just thinking about it, my skin gets a little weird.
Okay.
Well, because the thing that immediately there were a couple of things that registered as completely off when we saw this thing, which is that her legs were moving at one speed, her body was moving much faster than the legs were moving.
Huh.
So that was already, visually, especially as part of what I do in my life is I do animation. And so I am intimately familiar with the idea of creating convincing motion in animation. And when you're seeing something in the real world where the sync is off, where again the legs are kind of moving slowly, but the thing the legs are attached to is moving quickly, immediately your brain goes, oh no, that's something wrong there. But then the thing that really stood out about this, whatever it was that this happened outside in daylight, where its eyes and its mouth there was nothing. It was just blackness.
Ooh.
There were no eyes, there was no mouth. And in the end, this thing went and sort of seemed to sit down in this seating area.
Huh.
And I dragged my friend out to get close to this thing. We ended up sitting 15 feet away from it. And we're both like, what the hell is going on here? And, it was this fine balance, this balancing act of being really, really scared, but also really, really fascinated. Like, what is going on here? And for me, it was not my first anomalous experience by a long shot. So, unfortunately, I had some experience dealing with things that were really weird. And the long and short of it is then this thing got up after a certain amount of time. It got up and it started drifting away, and we watched it sort of dematerialize right into thin air. Now, I don't know what this thing was. I can... And there's an episode of the Paracast where my friend came on the show and identified himself by his real name.
Wow.
And we talked about this, and we went through a large amount of detail, which, interestingly enough, after that episode aired, there were some people who said, too much information, way too much detail. He could have made the story a lot shorter.
Why should you?
Well, that's clearly not somebody who's a researcher talking. because it's like too much detail, huh? But that's part of the reality of today's internet age. There's an internet acronym, TL:DR, which stands for too long didn't read.
Oh,
Yes.
Right, it's like the standard response if somebody is on an online forum and somebody posts a long thing, someone will put that little line up and then give their opinion, which qualifies their opinion basically being useless. So it was interesting in that some of the people who responded when my friend Bill and I talked about that, they were saying, well, you know, they try to drag the story out. And it's like, well, we're trying to give you guys all the details and the information because maybe somebody can make use of that to help us figure out what the heck we saw. So here's my overall point about this, is that I've never made any sort of statement about what I thought this was. I had some feelings that I might have shared about what I felt at the time seeing this, but to say it's a ghost, it was a girl and she was dressed like in kind of 70s garb. And this happened in the 90s. So it was like, well, gee, maybe it was a ghost. I don't know what a ghost even is. Was it an apparition? It was an apparition. It dematerialized. It looked human. It didn't have eyes, didn't have a mouth. That's what I know. I don't know what it is. I don't know where it came from. I certainly don't know where it went. And I don't try to draw any conclusions about it because that's the step where I think people really impose their human insecurities on things. And it's just about, we want to be in control. Every human wants to be in control, and we want to be in control of our reality and as far as we can be. And we don't want big questions, unanswered questions hanging in front of us, especially when it involves direct sensory experience. We want to be able to know what it is that happened. So for me, I look at that and I think to me it's a standout experience, but it's one of so many that I've had that, quite frankly, I've sort of lost track of all the things I've experienced.
Yes, I can understand that. What has been the latest experience you may have had, David, that you would like to share, that is?
Oh, I'm thinking.
Well, while you're thinking, it's interesting that Fahrusha is indeed a psychic and can pick up things that I cannot. I mean, I am about as far from being psychic as you get, I'm pretty sure. And she and I have often speculated that it's sort of like, and you might add to this too, it's like the antenna, like different people can pick up different frequencies. And when someone like yourself tells me that you've had a lot of anomalous experiences, I sort of think that your antenna is more finely tuned than mine, because I haven't seen anything like well, actually, I did. Actually,
I've seen a lot of things.
Yeah, actually, I did. Now comes, I saw this huge black caped figure of some male figure that was just enormous, with his arms crossed, staring at me, and I went, "Ooh." And he said, "Don't worry, I'm here to protect you." And I said, "Good to know." And then he disappeared. So I guess I have had some, but nowhere near the amount that Fahrusha has had and that you seem to have had. And since you are in media and technology, do you think that there's any, whilst you're perusing, what your latest experience would be?
Well, the thing is, I'm hesitant to share experiences where I don't have corroborating witnesses.
Oh, that's okay. We'll believe you.
Well, I wouldn't want you to, actually. I would hope you wouldn't. No, I would hope you wouldn't.
On.
No, I'm being serious.
Well, so am I. Come on, we'd love to hear them. I trust you.
Well, you shouldn't trust me.
Well, yeah, I should, because I've known you of you for a long time.
And I guess this is where I'm a New Yorker, right? I'm a sort of this diehard Brooklyn boy where I've learned to be much less trusting.
Well, I'm from Yonkers, and I still trust you.
Well, Yonkers ain't Brooklyn, lady.
It certainly is not.
Oh, yeah. These days, I think it's even a lot more affordable than Brooklyn.
Oh, God.
Which is just, anyway.
Okay.
We're not going to go down that road.
Okay, good.
So I'm trying to think, like, what could I point out that's been really, truly and I know there's like something in my brain is saying, well, you just had something happen, and literally they start to sort of bleed together to the point where I start to question my own senses, and this is where you can start to really lose it with this stuff.
Yes.
By basically just pondering it too much self introspection on this stuff will start to get to you. And this is the thing that I work very hard at keeping myself interested in things other than this. Not that I don't work very hard at it. I just find that a lot of the time I don't obsess about these things. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. When you go on social media websites like Facebook, which I'm very active on, it's interesting to me how so often you will see people who will have their personal website or their Facebook page, and it will be completely devoted to, let's say, the UFO topic. Their avatar, their profile picture is like a little manipulated gray being with their eyes or something. Everything they post is about this topic. I think that's unhealthy.
Probably
I think it's
true.
I think it's very unhealthy to put that kind of a vibe out about oneself. I just think it's unhealthy to be that obsessed with any one topic. I'm a man of many hobbies and many interests, and people who read my online musings, they know this. I'm very political. I'm very interested in art and music. I'm really into technology. I love weird software that makes weird sounds. That, to me, left to my own devices, it's all I'd ever do ever again is make weird sounds with computers and iPads and synthesizers and strange devices that I put my head into and think music and it comes out. And I try to sort of keep interested in a lot of different things just because otherwise one goes down this sort of tunnel that gets dangerous.
Mentally dangerous, yeah.
Oh, clearly.
I know since I was a child, I have always had to meaningfully focus on being in the, 4D reality that we purportedly share. And I've always had to absolutely try not to let it go. And that doesn't say much for my sanity.
I would never have guessed that.
Well, what I find is that music will cure everything in the end. Making it, listening to it, it is truly the thing that has saved me in my life. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the most noble thing that humans have ever come up with.
Well, if I could just interject a personal note here.
Sure.
Bill, our esteemed producer has also had a personal experience, and it was difficult for him, I think, if I'm right, Bill, for him to express it, and so what he did was translate it into a musical piece. And
Great idea.
Yeah, and when I heard the piece, I thought, that sounds just like it would be. And, it was really so... music is interesting, it's been a part of human culture since the first cave guys ugged in unison.
Well,
organized religion figured that out a long time ago.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you, Mr. Bach.
Well, it's true. I mean, they used the power of music in a way that was very mesmerizing.
I wish Bill had the microphone now. He'd tell you about the evils. What is it, the seventh chord that you were telling me about? That one that... the tritone. The tritone,
Tritones, yeah.
Which I'm sorry, I'm very not... Anyway.
Just getting back onto topic here.
Yes, sorry.
Could you tell us a little bit about the NARCAP report and what you did with the NARCAP report?
So that NARCAP report that you referenced had been created as an analysis of what happened in Chicago at the O'Hare Airport. It was November of, I want to say, 2006. I don't have it right in front of me.
I think it was later, but I couldn't tell you what year.
Remember.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, now you're going to make me look it up. Well, it was a very popularized incident that had occurred. Yeah, it was 2006, November of 2006, okay. November 7th, where there reportedly a number of people had seen a craft, a circular disc-shaped craft hovering above, I believe it was the C terminal at O'Hare Airport. It had been seen by supposedly crew on the ground, United crew. It had been seen supposedly by a pilot. Some people who were at the airport had seen this thing. It was hovering in the sky over this terminal for, I think, like 20 minutes. And then it basically, and it was an overcast day. The thing shot straight up into the air so quickly and without any sound, which is very interesting. It shot up so fast that it like left this hole in the cloud cover where people could see for just a few minutes or whatever the blue sky showing through on the other side of the clouds. United tried to squelch this episode, and there's been a lot of press coverage. It was, I believe, John Hilkovich, or forget the reporter's name at the Chicago Tribune, who had written this thing up. I believe it was the January after it happened, and it created a huge amount of interest. And NARCAP, being primarily interested in UFO phenomena that deal with interactions with avionics, they got on it. And my involvement dealt with some image analysis, with some with a particular image that surfaced that was supposedly supposed to be an image that was shot potentially by a pilot who saw this thing through the airplane cockpit and took a picture of it. And myself and a former research partner who I now have nothing to do with, we took a look at this and we came up with some interesting conclusions about this image, specifically primarily focusing on my contention that the image had been tampered with.
Oh.
But it had been tampered with in a way that seemed to indicate some very sophisticated attempts to not only spread disinformation, but potentially discredit any image analyst who might come out and proclaim that the image was legitimate and genuine. I found the equivalent of a digital fingerprint in the image that indicated that there was something very nefarious going on. And at that point, and this had been information I had shared with the NARCAP folks, and so they put me in their report.
November 7th, 2006 was the date of the O'Hare. Just FYI.
Yeah. So it was a very interesting high-profile UFO case that generated a certain amount of press interest. It generated a huge amount of public interest. I think the Tribune said that it was it had the largest number of hits any article had ever had on their site. But again, what conclusions can we draw from that episode? Let's assume for a moment that it went down the way that certain witnesses claimed it did. I'll make a statement to you that will kind of underscore my own sort of tendencies of thinking about the UFO phenomena, which is, and there are many different forms of, it's not, I say phenomena because there are multiple types of manifestations of these things, and there are different scales of it. But my contention is that if something is clearly not human technology, we see it and it flies away from the Earth, that is not to say definitively that it's not terrestrial. And that's where things get a little complicated. And my own line of thinking about a lot of these things kept steering me in that direction, and kept telling me that there were levels of deception going on here that would make it very difficult to have any kind of statement that was absolutely conclusive, because it's my contention that whatever is behind these things does not want us to understand what's going on. And that leads me down certain paths that are uncomfortable. Because I kept coming up with this idea that, by the way, I had many discussions about this, both on air and privately, with a fellow who passed away a number of years ago, who Mac Tonys, who ended up writing this very short book. In fact, the book was published after he died, and I don't know that it was really complete yet, called The Crypto-Terrestrials, where Mac and I have been talking quite a bit about the idea that perhaps we were not at the top of the evolutionary chain on this planet.
I sure as hell hope we're not, because it's a sad idea if we are.
Yeah, but it's a little scary to think that maybe if we're not, that we're not because we're not supposed to know we're not. This is again, and part of the problem in having useful, practical, constructive discussions about this is that if you don't play into sort of story threads that already exist, it gets too weird for people, right? To talk about, let's say, craft coming from another planet, coming here, and then, immediately the Shostak's and the physicists and the scientists are like, well, it would take too long to get here. Well, yeah, based on our propulsion, it would take way too long.
On 1950s technology, that is. Right?
Well, yeah. Look, and this is where one has to step back and understand something about the true level of science we actually know about our evolution, which is clearly points out that we are not an advanced species. We are not very evolved, nowhere near as much as we'd like to think we are. And I'm not even talking about the religious people who believe we're some kind of definitive expression of the grand mind and heart and creature that created the universe. To me, that's just so nonsensical as to be really laughable at this point. But we have not been doing science for a long time as a species. We've been doing flight for just over 100 years. It's not very significant. We made some great strides in the last century. Putting humans on another planetary body, which happened in my lifetime, was huge. Sadly witnessed the fact that today you have a significant number of people who refuse to believe that actually happened. Every time I see the Apollo deniers, it drives me nuts. The greatest thing humans have ever done since we crawled out of the mud, and people don't want to believe it just, a few decades after it happened. That's very, very sad.
David?
Yes?
I'm wondering, I have two questions here for you that relate, and one thing is, would you say that the general direction that you and Mac Tonys were going along somewhat mirrored what John Keel and Jacques Vallée have written? That's the first question. And the second question is, why do you think we haven't gone back to the moon? Do you believe it's totally financial, or do you think there are perhaps other reasons?
Go to the second question first.
Second question first. I believe it's political and financial. When one looks at the context under which the American space program played out in the 50s and the 60s, and then into the 70s, it was really, that was more political than anything else, ultimately. We were in this grand race with the Russians, and it was about the frailty of human egos, I think, more than anything else. There was a large amount of scientific curiosity, don't get me wrong, but I don't know that that's necessarily what absolutely motivated the missions. Later on, the massive costs involved, I think, as our culture sort of took a bit of a different turn, those were seen as just simply being unsustainable. And I think that nowadays, when you talk about going back to the moon, it's a hard sell because of the kind of costs involved are just so fantastic. And it's sad to me because when you think about what we could have done with all the money that was burned, let's say in Iraq and Afghanistan, who knows what we could have done constructively with that money to not only go back to the moon, but figure out a really good set of reasons to go back to the moon, of which there are a number. I think that part of the problem with the masses is that they parse all of this and through the almost exclusively through the lens of science fiction. which is all good and fine, but it, ask somebody about the logistics of actually putting a few people on the moon, and they immediately think in terms of sort of the Apollo 13 movie, when they're not really thinking about the real hardcore engineering involved, which is rather significant. And so I think that the moon issue is just a problem of societal motivation. Our society is now much more wrapped up with our experience on Earth, not so much in space.
Well, I would ask you just vis-a-vis that about the Chinese mission recently of the Jade Rabbit that they were
That
all
moon
very
mission, right.
excited about. And they landed this little robotic device on the moon. And then the excitement, it malfunctioned and the excitement disappeared. I'm wondering whether there was any other reason for their, lack of interest, or you don't...
Like some nefarious reason?
Yes, like somebody evil living on the moon and saying, "Get off our moon." I think that's why most people think we haven't gone back, like we were warned off.
The moon, from that point of view, is really important to Earth. I don't know that it's important to anyone else. Well, it's very important for us, but as far as... I'll give you an example of this, right? There are more productive places, for example, to find water in our solar system as compared to the moon, right? There are more productive places, I think, potentially to find power sources than the moon. Again, the moon is really fascinating and useful to Earth because without it, we'd have a hard time with our tides. We'd have our climate would look very different.
Yes.
But this idea that something else is on the moon and doesn't want us there, I think that's a human way of seeing things. I don't necessarily know that I would prescribe that to advanced beings thinking that way.
What about as an outpost to observe us rather limited humans?
Or even like a crypto human or crypto terrestrial or whatever. Because I agree with you. I mean, it seems like most of these things spring from right around here, if not just Earth, maybe the moon as well.
A couple of things. First of all, I don't think that humans at this point have a tremendously excellent grasp on the true history of our planet. I don't think we do. I think that there are very likely more things that we suspect are real are actually incorrect about the history of this planet. And again, I come back to this simple idea, and this is based on, by the way, humility. When I would talk about these things on the Paracast, people would attack me saying, "Who do you think you know everything?" It's like, no, I think I actually assume I know nothing. And so starting from that place, I'm not willing to draw conclusions. I just want to basically open up the thought process around this.
What are one of the things that you think that is accepted about human history or the planet's history, that, like some quasi-scientific accepted fact that is factoid, shall we say, that isn't really likely?
Something that's not really likely?
Yeah, that you think that in other words, you had just said that we're going to come upon at some juncture that many of the things that we've accepted about the planetary history and humans on the planet is going to prove to be false. I'm not disputing that may very well be the case, especially in the case of certain artifacts that appear to have been found, and the dating on the Sphinx and the new findings out there in Turkey of the 20,000-year-old.
I can't think of it.
Oh God.
B. Does it start with the B? Anyway.
But what is one thing that is significant? Not something insignificant like the three-toed sloths once had four toes or something like that.
Well, I'll give you one example.
Okay.
Because we were talking about the moon before, right?
Yes.
There are many theories floating around about how the moon got where it is, where it came from, why it has this sort of incredible balance with respect to our planet. I don't think we're anywhere close to having real knowledge of the sourcing of our moon.
It's older than the Earth, apparently. That's what they've said. No?
Well,
possibly.
Based on one rock.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. I'll tell you, actually, Fahrusha and I tried to do a show once on the moon. And remember that? Because there's so many unanswered questions about it.
Well, and there's a lot of noise around the moon suggesting, for example, even recently there had been a special on one of the cable television channels about all of the anomalous imagery on the moon.
And then they ended with that horrible wax dummies of the
it was just,
Asian woman. It just
terrible. The whole thing was, I think, just a real problem.
It was Kvyat, wasn't it, again?
Yeah, Bob Kvyat, another complete BS artist who, at this point, is vetted. We know who he is.
Yes, so
we know he's an entertainer. He's got nothing to do with research. So he's tainted. And we said we wouldn't talk about tainted personalities.
No, we won't. I couldn't help saying it because it just brought up I was watching that,
right.
And it was, there was some interesting things and some not so interesting things. And then they dragged out that wax figure of an Asian woman.
Right. So here's the thing. The vast majority of what was on that show to me was just absolute junk. There are a handful, and in particular, there's one image in particular of something, of an artifact on the moon. Now, most of what they covered in that show to me was very prosaic, very explainable. A lot of it had to do with old imagery they were looking at, where they were seeing degraded images, and they were making assumptions based on degraded images. A terrible problem. But there is one particular image of, and the problem is I've not done the time to go and do the research to find out what is the scale of this thing. Is it in a place where potentially maybe a Russian probe at some point crashed and put itself on there? But there is one set of structures on the moon that look to me, to my eye, like some kind of cogs or wheels, where the image of what we're seeing, to my mind, is clearly manufactured. It is not a natural thing. And I say this with the idea that I've seen so many people put so many images, not just of the moon, but of Mars, things that definitely have prosaic explanations where, people, a pareidolia comes in and people see what their brain tells them they want to see. But there's one photo in particular of this one structure on the moon that, to me, it wants further analysis. It wants further research to sort of establish what isn't it, which might suggest possibly that maybe there had been a technologically sophisticated
visitor?
No, not visitor. Society on this planet that at some point potentially destroyed itself.
Oh, on this planet?
On this planet,
okay.
Yeah.
I was saying visitor to the moon.
Right, from here.
There would be visitors from here.
Correct, from here.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying I believe that, but I'm saying that it's as possible as anything else from my point of view. Mm-hmm. Because I keep coming back to this idea that, for example, understanding the history of life on the planet, right? Right now, the biologist Edward O. Wilson is probably one of the smartest biologists on the face of the earth.
And unsung hero.
Just a brilliant, brilliant man.
Yeah.
Where a handful of years ago, he was on the Bill Moyers show, and Moyers says something like, well, we know about the majority of life on the planet. And Wilson's like, no. We have not discovered the vast majority of life on the planet. And Wilson posited that it was probably around 85% of the life on the planet remains unknown to us. And yeah, a bunch of it are insects and microbial life, but at the same time, we're still finding new mammals. Gee, underneath of the ice packs in the Arctic, we're finding creatures that aren't supposed to be able to live down that deep under those kind of pressures and that kind of cold. So let's assume for a minute that Wilson is correct. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt because he's a really smart guy who spent his entire life studying this.
Well, you must like him because he is.
I love him.
He's a naturalist, and he does
Yeah.
exactly what you do. He just looks at things, and he goes, "Okay, this is X, that's Y,
Yeah.
so X plus Y. Oh, it does equal Z."
Right.
And he doesn't put any.
There's no overlays
Personal-
on it.
yeah,
No. He's a true scientist.
Yes, he is.
So if we assume that he's correct, right? Now we look at our study of life on this planet primarily based on the fossil record. So, okay, that's good and fine. There are tons of fossils of interesting creatures, but then one begins to understand that in the case of fossils, fossils form under specific sets of conditions. Fossils are not universal. They show up more in certain places on Earth than others. And things that are likely to be fossilized probably ended up collapsing into a bog. There were certain types of ground that facilitated the creatures with exoskeletons making impressions. The fossil record is in no way, in my mind, a complete accounting of life on Earth. In fact, if we assume that Wilson is right, and we're not aware currently of the majority of species that have lived on the planet, then just statistically, one then looks at the amount of fossils that have been collected and the conditions under which those fossils would have actually been created. And one realized that there's a very good likelihood that the majority of life that has lived on this planet never produced fossils and is unknown to us. You could very easily make this argument and back it up with some real data. So just assuming that the fossil record gives us the full picture of what happened here, I think is extremely problematic and most likely is erroneous. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to throw my big overlay on this, which has always been my thought, which is that we tend to parse life based on our understanding and our experience of what it is. And I think that is very limiting. And it's a limitation of our own senses and our own evolution. All right? Humans still have you take most scientific thinkers and you throw the Gaia theory at them, and they kind of melt down. They don't want to believe. They have a huge problem believing or accepting in any way the idea that maybe the planet is actually some form of organization of life that has some meta-intelligence. And this is where we now tie back into what Jacques Vallée was positing, which is that he thought maybe UFOs and the UFO phenomenon was some attempt from some misunderstood or completely unknown mechanism in the planet to sort of jumpstart our evolution and to get us to quickly evolve, because maybe there's some dire stuff happening that we need to really open up our minds about in order to potentially make some constructive moves. And that was one of the things that Vallée put forward, that maybe UFOs were some sort of a control mechanism on the part of the planet. I don't know if I can completely accept that. I have a few issues with it. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly possible.
Well, it kind of, I think the crux of the matter that you began to speak about just previous to mentioning Vallée, and when you started to talk about the Gaia principle and a lot of science not being able to really get their head around that, it comes down to me for the meaning of life. Is life have to be something that is breathing, or is life about consciousness? And that's where I think many in the scientific fields kind of boggle over that, because science has not been able to really explain what consciousness is. But to me, you talk about the word believe, and I have a lot of problems with it as well. But when it comes to the Gaia principle, I'm as close to believing that as I am to believing anything. And So I think that the real problem there is, how do you define life? Is it about respirating, or is it about consciousness?
Well, my personal belief along these lines, based on an experience that I've talked about in multiple venues when my mother passed away,
Right.
where she did something that we had spoken about before she died, which was to give me some sort of sign of continuance. And we probably don't have time in this show to get into that story, but she did something that to me strongly indicated a persistence of identity post death. I can't prove it to anybody, but it was something that I feel she did for me to address a request I had made of her before she died. Now that to me would suggest, and again, this is the kind of thing where, an atheist hears this and immediately is like, "Oh, what are you, some God breather? So you believe there's continuous after death?" And it's like, dude, slow down. This connection of interest in afterlife defined as some sort of continuity after death, in my mind, has no connection to what religion considers to be God. I don't see why those two are always tied together, but part of that is cultural conditioning. That's how people have been taught to believe these things. Now, as far as life is concerned, if we look at individual human beings, and what that we call a human being a sentient being, but then we see that humans in groups start to exhibit certain types of behavioral patterns that seem to exist outside of the internal experience of the individual. Well, is that group intelligence going on? What are those dynamics? And now if we sort of come away from that, well, the Earth seems to be some kind of a closed loop feedback system. Stuff comes in from space, maybe based on the panspermia theory. Maybe that's how life started on Earth, by something crashing into here and finding a hospitable environment. Maybe that's how the water got here. We have lots of theories about these things, and some are more viable than others. But it's to me, it still gives us, I think, a working model in that we can start to think that there are connections between life on the planet, different forms of life, that we simply are not in a position to understand. Our science is simply not that good yet. And it's part of it is a limit of technology, where we rely on instrumentation for science. We rely on repeatability and consistency. And there are aspects of the study of, for example, particle physics that start to suggest that repeatability and consistency are not as repeatable and consistent as we'd like them to be. And that, by the way, is the problem in trying to talk about the anomalous, in that the scientific mind says, you've got to be able to repeat something. If you can repeat it, then I'm even willing to listen to you. And the problem being that we don't control how most anomalous events, genuine, quote-unquote, anomalous events, humans have no control over them.
And David, I hate to say this because I could go on talking to you for at least another 10 hours.
We're out of time.
But Alpha has become Omega, and we have agreed that there is just not enough evidence.
Well, can we say certainly that we would love to have you back again.
Please.
And talk with us again. Please come back. And I wanted to say that David also has his own podcast, which is called The Angry Human, which is also a radio show on Rockland World Radio. And if you want to give the time of that show, please feel free.
Is it a call-in show too, Dave?
It's not a call-in show, though. Okay. We get a lot of requests for that.
I bet.
It's on Wednesday nights at it's typically 8:30 to 9:30 Eastern Time. Actually, I would just say anybody go into any search engine, just type the words "angry human," 2 words, and in the 200 and something million hits you'll get,
I was going to say.
The show page is the very first hit.
Wow. Well, thank you so very much. And I am sure that some of our listeners will want to make comments at shatteredrealitypodcast.com. That's shatteredrealitypodcast.com. Please write in, ask questions, ask about having particular guests on that you would like to hear. And I just know that our listeners will want to hear from you again, Mr. David Biedny. And thank you, Kate Valentine, and I'm Fahrusha.
And really, all I can say again is thanks a lot, David. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
You're both very welcome.
Okay, bye-bye.
Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality. Shattered Reality.